Okay. So the most dramatic thing during the presentation is to share the PowerPoint. If I see this correctly, I was successful in it. So I'm very grateful to my friend Stjepan Stivic and also to all organizers for this invitation. I indeed think this kind of conference is very important, and I'm very sorry that I can be with you today in person, but I will try to make this better on some other occasion. So the notion that the relationships between the church and secular authorities is different in Western and Eastern Christianity is much widespread. And it was probably only corroborated by a relatively fresh experience when many Orthodox and Catholic believers in Central and Eastern Europe lived under communism quite recently. And there it was the notion that the Catholic Church, despite of all difficulties, showed greater resilience in her relationship to secular authorities. But the point of my paper will be that this difference was not caused by ideal foundations, because both Eastern and Western Christianity shared, in fact, main foundations of formation of these relationships between throne and altar. The first experience of Christians in very beginnings of the Christianity was twofold. On one hand, for the first 300 years, Christians used to live in an environment where both secular authorities and majority pagan environment mainly chose to simply ignore them, as if Christian communities didn't exist. That's very important, because it formed ever since a part of Christian DNA, because Christians instinctively knew that there would be situations where they absolutely couldn't rely on secular authorities. Of course, this basic situation from the antiquity was later changed in both West and the East, but nevertheless, it still remained an important early experience. On the other hand, Christians were faced from the very beginning with a great problem in their relationships to secular power, to secular or political authorities. If they took their Christianity seriously, they couldn't take part in the worship of emperor, which became the link between all subjects of the Roman Empire very early in the history of Christianity. So they tried to compensate for this great handicap by affirming their steadfast loyalty to secular power and to the person of emperor himself. And this is already visible in early scriptural foundations, in the early New Testament texts, particularly in the famous passage from the letter of the Apostle St. Paul to the Romans in 13th chapter, where there are almost no limitation put on secular authority because it is divine in origin in St. Paul's view. And I even have the impression that this secular authority didn't have any real obligations towards its subjects. Why St. Paul put the things so radically and drastically, particularly in view of the later development? I think he did so because he expected the second coming of Christ very soon. So he assumed that this question of the relationship between church and state wouldn't be of much importance. His view was later echoed also by some other New Testament texts, particularly by the first epistle of St. Peter in the 2nd chapter, where the main tone is the same as in the Romans. Of course, there is also another current present in the New Testament, particularly in the last book of the New Testament, in the Revelation of St. John, where Rome is clearly identified as Babylon and seen in a much degrading view. But this current was clearly a minority view among Christians in antiquity and also during the later periods, although this current existed. It must also be said that another very important passage for the formation of relationship between church and state, the scene of Caesar's coin in synoptic gospels, is much more ambiguous than the passage by St. Paul, although there was a tendency among Christian writers to interpret this passage also in a way more favorable to the emperor. Although, in my view, it is clear from the words of Jesus that the real emphasis is on the notion that there are spheres where emperor had no entrance. These scriptural foundations and this basic experience of the relation towards secular power is clearly shared by Western and Eastern Christianity. And it was also repeated by many early Christian authors, particularly by apologists, even by Tertullian, although in his writings we also can see some ironic passages, but he remained true to the basic concept of explicit loyalty of the Christians to the emperor and to the secular power. Now, the situation changed dramatically and also somehow rapidly with the conversion, with the unexpected conversion of Constantine the Great at the beginning of the 4th century. And it is important to quote the famous German church historian Hartmut Lepin, who once wrote that it was completely unimaginable, even at the end of the 3rd century, for the Christians that emperor could be Christian, because his functions were at the time so much connected to various forms of pagan worship. So this change at the beginning of the 4th century was dramatic in more than one way. And it also calls for the new definition of the relationship between church and political authority, of course, building on scriptural basis and on the basis of early apologists. And there are two main starting points for the new definition of the relationship between church and state, between bishops and emperor, between bishops and kings later on. And this starting point in the West is a definition from the letter which the Bishop of Rome, Gelasius I, wrote to the Eastern Roman Emperor Anastasius I at the time of one of minor schisms in the history of the church at the end of the 5th century. The other one is similar definition written by the Emperor Justinian I the Great, somehow some decades later, at the beginning of the 6th century, in the preface to his 6th novel. And it is often assumed that this preface by the Emperor Justinian forms the base of the notion of the so-called symphony between church and state in Eastern Christian traditions, which is supposed to be different to the somehow more conflict relationship between imperium and sacerdotium in the West. But if we read these ideological foundations or these ideal foundations in Pope Gelasius and in the Emperor Justinian, then we can say that all the basic ideas are the same. There are two separate powers in the world according to both texts, and one power is secular power represented by emperor or by political authority, and the second power is spiritual power represented by priests and bishops. And basically, in both cases, these powers are equal. Also in Justinian, and even more, both authors, Gelasius I and Justinian I, emphasized that since holders of spiritual power, bishops and priests, perform their duties not only for themselves or for other people, but also for holders of secular powers, they should enjoy particular respect. And in this case, or from this origin, the highest worth of spiritual power could be deduced. And this is not only limited to the Western view, to the ideas formulated by Pope Gelasius, but the same notion is also present in this so-called Magna Carta of the idea of symphony by Emperor Justinian. The only difference is perhaps the person of both authors. And it is, of course, significant that the definition of the proper relationship between spiritual and secular power was defined by the Pope in the West, by a bishop in the West, and by an emperor in the West, in the East. And this by an emperor who was also an avid theologian, of course. So we cannot assume that the foundations of the relationship between church and political authorities is different in the East from that in the West. What in fact was different was, like Dr. Wedrich already showed, for another aspect of the building of these differences between East and West, was political development, which was in fact quite different and was marked by a great and grave crisis of the secular authority in the West, in the former Western part of the Roman Empire, and by the stability of the same secular power and the secular authority in the eastern part of the former Roman Empire. Because even if the position of the emperor was held by a person who was personally weak, like the famous Eastern Roman Emperor Theodosius II in the first half of the 5th century, the imperial authority in the East remained intact. On the other hand, the case of Theodosius' relative, Valentinian III, in the West shows us that a weak emperor also weakened the idea of imperial authority itself. Of course, particularly because of the fact that the objective circumstances of Valentinian's rule were much more difficult in the West than the objective circumstances of Theodosius' rule in the East. And then this crisis of secular power in the West only deepened from the end of the 5th century till the revival of this secular power with the Franks in the early Middle Ages. And that was an opportunity, of course, not an opportunity which was intended for the church to establish herself as a much more independent institution in the West during the early Middle Ages. And she retained her so-won strength only after also after the revival of the secular power, particularly since the beginning of the 9th century. And that's why the relationship between church and secular authorities remained strained, much more strained in the West than in the East, where the imperial authority was never weakened. Nevertheless, the basic idea of the need for cooperation between church and secular authorities remained vivid also in the West and was never abandoned. So the notion of the so-called Reichskirche, as in the later Holy Roman Empire, was an ideal which was never really abolished also in the West and was much more common than the periods of protracted conflicts. Although, particularly in the Catholic historiography, the emphasis is almost always on these cases of conflict, like the famous conflict of investiture during the High Middle Ages. And to conclude, there was also another development limited only to the West, which probably changed the relationship between church and state for good in the West, but not in the East. And this is the experience of wars of religion during the 16th and 17th centuries, which put to the fore calls for separation between church and state, and even between religion in society. And this concept is something which is completely alien to the Eastern Christianity, where this experience of wars of religion during the early modern age, of course, never existed. And if the areas of Eastern Christianity ever accepted the idea of separation between church and state, then it was, of course, imported from the West. But it is clear, I think, from this presentation that basic foundations for the formation of relationship between church and state in both parts of European Christianity were basically the same and were founded on the same early experiences of the first church or early Christianity, even before Constantine. Thank you for your attention.